Unit 2, Lesson 7, The Effects of Industrialization. Unit 2, Lesson 7, Vocabulary. We'll start off this examination of the effects of industrialization with a famous line from Hard Times by Charles Dickens. It was a town of red brick, or brick that would have been red if the smoke and ashes had allowed it. But as matters stood, it was a town of unnatural red and black, like the painted faces of a savage. It was a town of machinery and tall chimneys, out which interminable serpents of smoke trailed themselves forever and ever, and never got uncoiled. It had a black canal, and a river ran purple with ill-smelling dye. Let's look into what some of the effects of the Industrial Revolution were. The Industrial Revolution saw poor working conditions for men, women, and children throughout the country. Factory conditions were incredibly harsh. Men, women, and children often worked 12 to 16 hours a day or more. Work was very dangerous and unhealthy. Women were hired because they could be paid less than men. Children were hired by textile mills and mines because of their size, and they could be paid less than even women. The Industrial Revolution created a new class structure or class system within England of a truly upper class, the rich industrial business owners, an upper middle class of professionals like doctors and lawyers, and a lower middle class, people like teachers who had somewhat of a professional job, shop owners, and office workers, and then the new lower class of working class individuals, those factory workers that were seen as interchangeable and replaceable parts in the machinery of the Industrial Revolution. And how did this new class structure impact women? Well, middle class women enjoyed much more economic opportunities and had a greater access to education than they ever had before. Working class women, on the other hand, were often separated from their families, and some saw little to no improvement in their status. Though they were able to find jobs because more people could afford to hire them, so women were able to gain some sense of financial independence because of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution brought about a change in thinking about the status of economics within the country. So the problems caused by the Industrial Revolution caused many to look for solutions. Some believe the market, the open marketplace of capitalism, would eventually fix the problems, while others believed there should be a change in government to help regulate the businesses and regulate the capitalist system because it was becoming unbalanced. One of those newfound ideas of economics was laissez-faire economics. This was the idea that government should not interfere with businesses, that businesses are free to do what they want. This was coined by a gentleman named Adam Smith in his book, The Wealth of Nations. Becomes like the father of modern economics. He heavily promotes laissez-faire capitalism as a means of production for the privately owned use for profit. In his book, Smith argued that free market forces of supply and demand would produce more goods at lower prices. It would also encourage investors to invest money in new ideas. Smith claimed that the invisible hand of capitalism would lead individuals to work for their own good and the good for the entire community. Other effects of the Industrial Revolution are seen in the reforms that took place. When workers all throughout the country joined together to form labor unions, engaged in collective bargaining with employers, and if the employers refused, the workers would go on strike. This had many outcomes throughout the country throughout the decades. The Combination Acts outlawed unions but were repealed in Britain in 1824, which allowed for unions to go forward for the next 200 years. This also happened in the United States in 1886 with the American Federation of Labor led successful strikes in coal mining industries and other factory type work throughout America. But those workplace reforms initiated by labor unions saw Parliament pass the Factory Act of 1833 that we've already talked about, made it illegal to hire children under the age of 9, required all children to receive at least 2 hours of schooling per day, stated that children could not work more than 12 hours a day, depending on their age. This went a step further in 1842 with the Mines Act that prevented women and children from working underground, which was often the most dangerous working conditions throughout the country. And going a step further in 1847, they limited the workday throughout the country to no more than 10 hours per day, regardless of the job. Other notable effects of industrialization and the reform movement throughout England. In 1833, William Wilberforce was influential in getting the slave trade to end in Great Britain. This supposedly happened in the United States in 1865, in Puerto Rico in 1873, in Brazil in 1888. You had women activists meeting at the International Council for Women in 1888, trying to progress the needs and the women's movement throughout the country. Horace Mann, a philanthropist, he began advocating for free and public education for all children. And Alexis de Tocqueville sought reform for the conditions from prison, trying to seek fair and humane treatment of individuals incarcerated throughout the country. Other reform movements we've talked about during the Industrial Revolution were housing and community reforms. Early reform programs like the social gospel movement preached salvation through service to the poor. They exposed greed and corruption brought on by industrialization and the robber barons. They brought public attention to poor living and working conditions. Reformers began establishing settlement houses in the late 1800s to provide assistance in urban slums. Settlement houses offered classes such as English, painting, health, and college extension courses. They also helped pass tenement housing laws to improve safety and sanitation. Overflowing public toilets were commonplace. The streets were filled with horse manure, and unhygienic slaughterhouses led to a dramatic change in the public health legislation. Examples of urbanization: Manhattan Island, New York, then versus now. Dubai of the United Arab Emirates in 1990 versus Dubai of the United Arab Emirates today. Shanghai, 1990 versus Shanghai today in 2022. And lastly, a look at Houston, Texas in the 1920s, compared against a view of Houston, Texas today, a modern, industrialized, Americanized city.